250,000 people on the streets of London yesterday protesting against your government's policies. Are you listening to their concerns?
Well, certainly we're listening, and I talk regularly to the trade union movement. I think it's important we have a dialogue with them, but we're not going to change the basic economic strategy. As I think Jim Murphy himself said a few moments ago, no government, coalition, Labour, any other, would change its fundamental economic policy simply in response to a demonstration of that kind.
So, to put it another way, you're listening, but you're shrugging your shoulders.
No, I think it's important that we have a dialogue. Let me just, in my own department, for example, we're making some very, very difficult decisions. The Royal Mail, for example, we're having to deal with a failing nationalised industry, major changes affecting universities. We're putting those radical reforms through because we have to. But it's important that we continue to talk to the people who represent the workforce. That's, basic good relationships.
OK, to prove again that you're listening and maybe taking notice, there are reports in the papers that there's a kind of Lib Dem uprising against this £500 cap per week on benefits. Do you oppose that cap?
No, the Liberal Democrats support the thrust of the welfare reform, but there have been particular aspects of it. If you remember, there was the reduction in benefit people after a year on GSA. We've debated this in coalition, and some changes have been made. I'm not opposing the legislation. It's very good legislation, and it will provide much more of an incentive to work and to save than the current.
Sorry, that's quite interesting what you've just said. Might this be the next thing where there might be movement?
No, I think there is a coalition process. If there are things
is this being raised now?
Well, some of my colleagues are concerned about it, and they were reported in the press as expressing their concern this morning. And we have a constant process of discussing with our coalition partners. Often these issues.
So it's on the agenda.
Well, these issues are on the agenda the whole time, and we discuss them in a very business-like way. And often they cut across coalition.
Do you think you might get change on this?
I'm not pushing for change on this particular issue, but some of my colleagues have raised it, and the coalition works extremely well. When problems of this kind arise, they're thrashed out, and we make headway, and we're proceeding with very radical reform on a wide variety of fronts, including welfare reform.
And I want to talk to you a bit about the cuts that are being introduced, because they can actually be much deeper because of the high rate of inflation, aren't they?
Well, that may have the effect of accelerating reductions to some extent. We're not talking about vast inflation here, but certainly higher than was expected. And I think the whole issue about cuts, the question is raised, the purpose of the demonstration. People want to cut less or take longer over it. But what they're actually saying when you do that is that the government's got to borrow more in order to finance this period. And as we know from what's happening in financial markets and in Europe, it's actually very difficult for governments to borrow in these circumstances. It's very, very important that we establish confidence in our country, that we're fully solvent, and that provides the basis on which the private sector can grow.
Meanwhile, we have the Chancellor saying that he is opposed to the 50p tax rate and wants a review of it. Do you agree with that?
Well, certainly under normal conditions, 50% is a very high marginal rate of tax.
Too high?
Well, under normal conditions, I certainly argued in opposition, and my Lib Dem colleagues, that we were content with a 40% rate. But we also said, and actually George Osborne echoed this in the budget, that you have to look at other ways of dealing with unfairness in relation to wealth, for example, high-value property. And that would be the best way of looking at it, rather than having counterproductive, extremely high marginal rates of income tax.
If he discovered, as part of this review, that it really didn't bring in that much money, and that people who are very wealthy find other ways to deal with their tax affairs, they become limited companies or whatever it is that does it, would you then support the scrapping of the 50p tax rate? No,
I and George Osborne both agree that we have to move away from extremely high marginal rates of tax on income, including that.
So if it's not raising money, you scrap it?
Not immediately, but we have to move under conditions where a lot of people are suffering hardship. That high rate of tax serves a political purpose, but under normal conditions we would want to move to lower rates of marginal taxation on high earners, but it's got to be in the context of an overall fairness in the taxation, and there are other ways of doing it.
But he is saying there's no point in keeping it if it doesn't raise money. You seem to be saying something different.
I don't think I'm saying that at all. We need to look at the impact, of course.
Well, if it doesn't raise money, sorry, I just want to be clear about this. If it doesn't raise money, do you keep it?
No, you don't keep it indefinitely.
Well,
we've said
what if we find out in the next 3 months it's raised negligible amounts of money? Do you scrap it then?
Well, you've got to look at it in conjunction with other forms of taxation on the very wealthy. And what we're looking to do, and the Chancellor signalled this in the budget, that we need to do this in a more sensible way, because it may well be, as you say, that it's counterproductive. And if that is the case, we need to move away from it, and we need to find other ways of having fairness within the taxation system.
It's just that you've said completely different things about it. George Osborne has said, if it's not raising any money, we don't keep it. You've,
no,
on the other hand...
he didn't say that at all. He didn't say that at all. If you actually read the relevant section of the budget, he's wanting to approach this in a measured way.
Yeah, and he wants it to be evidence-based. You, on the other hand, said it is an important symbolic measure.
Well, he said that too, actually. If you reread the budget, he said that it was an important measure, symbolically, because a lot of people are feeling hardship, and they don't want to see, higher tax rates withdrawn from the very wealthy. But we've got to be guided by evidence. We've got to do this in a measured way, and we've got to look at the whole range of taxation as it affects very wealthy people.
Can we just talk about fuel prices? Are you satisfied that the cuts in duty are now being passed on to the motorists?
Well, I think we have to be vigilant. I mean, there may well be a competition policy issue at the forecourt through the oil industry, and it may well be that we'll have to look at whether competition works. But I think, broadly speaking, it is, and that was the purpose of the cuts that the Chancellor introduced. And
in your greener days, you used to say that high fuel prices were a good thing because they weaned people off petrol. Now you're in government, you're trying to cut the rate of duty.
No, in fact, we had this problem every year. Over the last 10 years, there have been 2 oil shocks. One
high prices are an advance warning of the need to move rapidly to a post-oil economy. Why, you might ask, where are Norwegian road hauliers and motorists not rioting in the streets of Oslo? They aren't, because instead of the gimmicky...
I think you have to distinguish between a general move towards higher energy prices as a way of moving to a low-carbon economy, and what happens in an oil shock. We had one in 2000, we had one in 2008, we've had one now, when there is a real hit on motorists, many of whom in rural areas don't have alternatives, and you've got to try to find a way of mitigating the damage, which is what we've done.
Fraser.
The cost of living now is the #1 issue out there in the country, not cuts, and yet your government has compounded this with a VAT increase in January. I mean, in opposition, you ran this very good poster of the VAT bombshell. You were right first time, weren't you?
No, the deficit has to be dealt with.
You can be cutting more and taxing less.
Everybody's agreed, I think, certainly in the business community and in the national financial markets, we had to cut the deficit, and we had to do so decisively.
You're not doing it very much.
And it's been done through a combination of spending cuts and this tax increase. Now, of course, there is pressure on living standards. We recognise that, and the reason for that is that we're now a poorer country. I mean, the GDP fell by over 5% in the financial crisis. Now, that was temporarily absorbed in government borrowing. That was not sustainable. It's now been felt by the public at large, and it is painful and it is difficult.
But if you look at what the budget was saying, that the cuts are 0.6% in the coming financial year. You can't cut much milder than that. Shouldn't you be cutting more and taxing less?
Well, we're doing it on a sustainable basis. I mean, you're quite right that in the current financial year there is an enormous difference between what the government's doing, which I think 16 billion, and what the Labour government were doing, which would have been 14 billion. But because it's a cumulative process, and this whole idea that opponents of the government have built up, that the government is making some massive, sudden cuts in public service, is actually completely wrong. It's a phased programme over the spending review.
Coming at it from a completely opposite side of the debate, when you woke up yesterday morning and looked in the mirror, was there not a small part of you that thought, I should be on that march today? I mean, before we had the election, you were saying that, when Nick Clegg was saying that it would be economic madness to take so much money out of the economy at a time when it was so risky. I mean, was there not any part of you that sympathised, particularly as there were a lot of Lib Dem supporters who were out on that demonstration yesterday who would have liked to have seen you there?
Well, I've been on plenty of protest marches, but I would not have been on that one. And my approach to deficit reduction...
There was no temptation for you to join?
No, let me just... Before the election, I set out my thinking about spending reduction and deficit reduction about a year before, in a pamphlet I wrote for the Reform, one of the think tanks, and it was very similar to the programme that the government has actually adopted. The fact is, we've had a massive hit on the economy as a result of the collapse of the banking system, recession, very painful steps we're going to have to be taken by any government to reduce the deficit. We're doing it, but we're doing it in a measured and sensible way.
OK, we're going to leave it there, but Vince Cable, I know you're going to stick with us, because in around